Okay. Good morning to you, Jeff Epton. How are you?
Good. How you doing, Michael?
I'm good. It's good to have you. I remember you were here, and I was actually at the cash register, and I was taking your money, I believe.
Yeah.
And we ended up talking. And it wasn't until this morning that I realized when when I was looking at your blog and checking out what we were going to talk about, that you are the son of an Epton who ran against Harold Washington. And the only reason I bring that up is because you mentioned it on your blog that it'll probably come up. So do you want to just say a word about that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Bernie was my dad in 1983 when he was running here against Harold Washington. I was actually running for office in Ann Arbor, Michigan, for the city council there.
On a different party.
Yeah, as a Democrat. And in fact, at the time, Harold Washington and I were both members of Democratic Socialists of America. So there's no question.
We always revel in the contradictions.
Yeah, that politically, I shared more with Harold than I did with Bernie, but that was a very complicated, emotional experience, just being 250 miles away. And my perspective on that was that Bernie involved himself in the race for mayor in a way that he had never participated in an election previously.
It was definitely a turn from what he had done before.
That's my feeling, and though he and Harold both lived bare 4.5 years. They both died. Harold in November of '87. My dad about 3 weeks later in December of '87. These are people who had been colleagues in the Illinois State Legislature. As a member of the Chicago legislative delegation, forget Democrat and Republican, there were far more similarities in how they approached legislation and politics in Springfield than differences.
Yeah.
That my father, during his time in the Illinois State Legislature, was probably the definition of a liberal Republican, and had been all his life, in fact, and urban progressive. I went to high school at Hyde Park High School, and one of my
my dad did too,
and my dad did, and one of my teachers there was a man named Tim Black.
Oh, great man.
Who's been president of the Illinois ACLU, has been a progressive force in the city for a really long time. He was a history teacher of mine. And when I'd come back to Chicago, visit Tim, he'd tell me stories, including that in 1948, he and Dad helped form the original Chicago area committee of Henry Wallace for president.
Wow.
So this
Henry Wallace was like a progressive guy who ran against
a socialist, yeah, who ran from the left against Truman. In 1950, when
wasn't he the vice president at one time, or what was he?
I think it was the vice president in
under Roosevelt.
40, and then was dumped for Truman in 44.
Okay. A little history here, everybody. You're listening to Live from the Heartland, and we're filling in the spaces from many years ago.
Well, the whole thing was, even Republicans in Chicago at that time, in the 50s, occupied a fairly wide range. In 1950, Bernie ran for the House of Representatives in a Republican primary. I was 3 years old. That was actually my first campaign. I don't remember it, but there are pictures of my dad holding me in his arms and waving to crowds in typical, politician type of pose. But he ran against a guy named Dick Vale, who was a McCarthyite, ultra-conservative, essentially. And in and Vail beat my father in the primary. In 52, Vail ran again against Barrett O'Hara, a Democrat who held the seat for many, many years, and actually, as part of his campaign red baited my dad. To say that in 1950, his campaign lit said he saved, I think it was the 2nd District, from Bernie Epton and his black friends.
Wow.
And had pictures of people like Archibald Carey, who was a Republican, a black minister, and a political leader. These were then the roots of where my father came from politically. He was a social liberal, a fiscal conservative maybe, though that wouldn't have defined the kind of Republican he was at the time.
Jeff, let me ask you, I mean, there's a lot of things we want to go forward on for today, but can maybe in reflecting about your father and that election when he went up against Harold Washington, when the phrase came out from the campaign literature to vote for Bernie Epton before it's too late. Now, what would have happened? I mean, this may be hard for you as his kid. Was that something that he condoned? Was that something that the campaign was out of his control? Any sense of that before we move on to something else?
Well, I think it was both. Something that he both condoned and somehow at the same time was out of his control. I mean, the lessons that I take from my dad's political career, from the last part of his life, from the 83 election, is essentially how easy it is to compromise one's principles in the heat of the moment.
That's really how easy it is to compromise one's principles in the heat of the moment. Let's all remember that.
Well, it's I was only an elected official for 6 years, and thinking back on it, can remember moments when I compromised my principles in ways that in some instances I came to regret almost immediately. In some instances I regretted only in the long term. And I think, though he had difficulty talking about it, that my dad believed, perhaps not explicitly, that the compromise that he made came at the expense of a reputation that he had built around political action in support of things that he'd believed in for years. Open housing, strong public institutions like quality, accessible public education for everyone. These were the things that I think were most important to him for his entire life. But at the end of the 83 election, he understood that people no longer saw him as that politician, and the next 4 years for him were excruciating precisely because of that. One story, and then maybe we could move on to some of the things that Bill and Bernardine were saying, that Tim Black told me about an encounter with Bernie a couple years after the election. When Dad came up to Tim, they met in some public place, and they greeted each other, and he said to Tim, my friends, meaning his political friends, his progressive friends, my friends abandoned me in the 83 election. And Tim, in a moment that I think was both loving and to Tim entirely necessary, said, "No, Bernie, you abandoned us." And I think that my father understood that, didn't particularly want to hear it. These were not things that he discussed easily in the 4 years of his life afterwards. There's probably one final thing. As I said, he and Harold, they served together. Harold once told a friend of mine late at night during the course of the campaign, who was highly critical of Bernie and the campaign that he was running. Harold said, "This is not Bernie Epton. You need to understand this."
Well, he clearly was an interesting person, and he did good by helping to bring you into the world. And you've done a lot of good.